Salutations, nerds. I'm Rick Y, the wise guy, and today is December 9th. You may be hearing this on December 10th, 2024. And it's time to broach a topic that's been a very difficult thing for me to parse for a number of reasons, but it holds incredible relevancy in the coming years. And it's the recent influence of Christian nationalism. Now, let's get one thing straight. I'm secular right now, but I grew up in the South and in a Christian family and environment. I was even a pallbearer in church for a time. I went to youth group. I attended Christian concerts and large events. I understand deeply much of the church and its roles in people's lives. So I take a position wherein I feel that as long as you maintain your faith in such a way that it doesn't infringe upon or oppress others, I'll gladly stand up for and stand beside you, regardless of that faith, be it Muslim, Christian, Judaism, hell, Zoroastrianism. And if you don't know what that is, consider it a prequel or like source guide for its following fan fiction. Basically, your faith is of no concern of mine. But your human and constitutional rights always will be. And that said, I'm not here to blast the faithful. In fact, if you choose to follow the gospel, but do so in a way that justifies being kind to everybody and reaching out with a modicum of empathy, I will defend your right to practice that faith. And I will always stand beside you as someone who has no real particular religious belief myself. And I understand that faith is an important way of life for many people. Trying to throw wrenches in that and derail a person's direction in their lives, it doesn't really help anybody. You know, it doesn't do anybody good. So I'm not here to try and create some kind of artificial turmoil. You don't need it. I don't need it. So why is Christian nationalism something that needs to even be talked about? Well, because a lot of people don't understand what it means, what the true nature of white Christian nationalism truly is. Where some would attribute it to waving a flag while wearing a cross necklace, others know it for what it is. And it's a tool to exploit people's faith and manipulate them against their own beliefs by justifying it with bastardized biblical prophecy. This in turn begins to establish a system that's not unlike the strict theological systems we see in groups like the Taliban and ISIS, where groups of highly motivated conservative fundamentalists use their religious beliefs to justify oppressing people with whom they don't understand, or with whom they take umbrage, or with whom they personally feel are to blame for their own problems in their life. These issues are widely seen by those who practice religious nationalism as grounds to attack people of different faiths, ethnicities, or lifestyles, even their identities. It starts by limiting their representation. Then it goes after their liberties and rights. And once they've no longer been allowed to speak out, it just further dehumanizes them so that radical people feel empowered to lash out at them. And finally, it uses these systems to subject human beings to alienation, torture, and eventually death. These are behaviors that we as Westerners consider abhorrent, even barbaric, when we hear stories of this kind of treatment of other human beings. I mean, we wouldn't tolerate it in our own country because there's no room for it. So why are we so quick to welcome it when it's holding up a crucifix? One of the driving concepts behind Christian nationalism is a slow introduction to religious and specifically Christian doctrines in our public spaces. From the adoption of the words, "In God we trust," getting plastered on a 2-cent piece in the 1860s, to the recent addition of the words "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance, a large portion of the First Amendment has been ignored or just simply overlooked for a very long time. And with this, a slow and insidious concept that the Christian religion itself is what bred America, when in historic reality the founders were what we call deists, who were adamantly against the establishment of any religion, as it's clearly defined in the Constitution. In fact, as deists, they all subscribed to monotheistic beliefs, that is, that they believed in a singular God and an afterlife, but specifically rejected the Bible as a guide for the government. The popular belief among deists is that God is like a watchmaker who designed the universe and then just disappeared. Yet, this information was forgotten. And as Christianity became the dominant religion in America, it did not take long before a group of people called Christian evangelicals saw the opportunity to use religion as a means of political power, and they seized it. The term itself can be traced back to the 16th century Puritans. So, I hope you're ready to take notes. I'm just kidding. I won't put you through that. Long story short, there were a couple of different periods wherein the evangelical Christians in America saw a growth in popularity. They called these periods the Great Awakenings. There's two of them, I believe. After those occurred, it had proven to be an established religious system in the United States that stemmed from older Protestant traditions. So these particular Christian sects have been around for a really long time. But it wasn't until only recently that they aimed their sights on political power and government roles. A big difference between evangelicals and other Christian beliefs is that unlike what is stated in Matthew 6:9, which begins the First Testament with how you should pray, and that was behind closed doors, evangelicals take later writings from the same Gospel of Matthew, like Matthew 28 verses 19 through 20, to spread the word and teachings of their Lord. So now we have two very different forms of believing the same set of values. One's out there shaking hands and the other's more introverted wallflowers. Fatefully, in the 1970s, the evangelicals started shaking hands with politicians. After the Watergate scandals, evangelicals needed a leader with more moral standing that would help usher in a more religious doctrine into the American way of life on the national stage. The corruption of the Nixon administration soured their mouth, and so they turned to an unlikely ally. He was born in Plains, Georgia, in 1924. He described his ideology as conservative or middle-of-the-road moderate, and even became governor of Georgia. Jimmy Carter had throughout his time attracted a lot of Southern evangelical leaders into his circle, and then his 1976 campaign. After establishing themselves as a national power at this point, and a number of, we'll call them concerning foreign diplomatic blunders that had occurred under his watch, they turned on Carter 4 years later and threw their support behind a very famous Ronald Reagan. In office, he welcomed evangelical leaders such as Jerry Falwell and James Dobson to the White House and further legitimized a religious Christian agenda by supporting religious legislation around school prayers and abortion access. And luckily, these things were shot down. But it was at this moment in time that conservative Republicans and theological motivations were interwoven so tightly that the only way to earn a Republican nomination was to declare yourself devout in the Christian faith specifically. The party couldn't walk away from the religious leaders and their congregations, and over the past few decades, politics, in turn, found its way into churches. Priests and worshipers bound their daily political beliefs with their theological standard of spreading the word of their own religious beliefs. At this point, there were businessmen and political leaders across the board who were able to manipulate this to their own advantage. You see, using the Bible, conservatives had oppressed minorities, women's rights, the LGBTQ community, and even their own political rivals, as long as they had a religious leader convincing them that it was somehow relevant to the gospel. They used their own interpretations to exploit the blind faith of most pious members of our society and turn them against their own neighbors. Through this, they were able to convince otherwise decent Americans that their hatred and mistreatment of others was justified. The people with the most corruption in their minds used the faith of Christians against them and slowly morphed what was originally supposed to be a forgiving religion of non-judgment into a set of guidelines on how to ignore everything they were taught by their Christ. With this, they co-opted patriotism. They created an atmosphere of acceptable cognitive dissonance that was directly attached to their own national identity. Those who find inhumane acts against themselves intolerable could and would find ways to excuse those very acts as long as it was holding a Bible and wrapped in an American flag. In the 80s and 90s, white supremacist groups like neo-Nazis eventually took advantage of this. They had a market for people willing to do and say terrible things in the name of a god or set of traditional religious dogmas that they convinced themselves had made them superior than the other people around them. And so eventually, in the early 2000s, when the Iraq and Afghanistan war began, it further added credence to those who saw the Middle East as this final battleground against good and evil in the book of Revelations. Churches would preach against the evil of the Muslim faith without ever opening a Quran. To this day, we have people like Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, who continue to try and use Judeo-Christian fears and presuppositions to justify their otherwise unacceptable positions. And like the evangelical leaders of the 70s, they're continuing to convince those of their Judeo-Christian faiths that their words and their positions are somehow backed by their God, that they're superior to everyone else specifically because they're white men who happen to live in North America. And oddly enough, Russian conservatives do the exact same thing with the exact same book to justify their horrendous stances. There's a pattern here, and it's clear as day. The most manipulative, ambitious government leaders always wish to convince you that they're ordained by God. Because of that, conservatives have elected people they wish to be controlled by instead of represented by. And we now have a man who has convinced himself that in his 78 years, he has never once done anything that requires forgiveness. He's spent his entire life in luxury while managing a charity that stole money from the poor. He's incapable of naming a single scripture when asked at a religious conference. He embodies the 7 deadly sins. If even a fraction of his sexual deviancies are true, he would be considered a serial adulterer. Yet, the once Democrat saw an opportunity to manipulate an entire political base, switched sides, and took them for a ride of their lives. Now they stand to have their lives ruined by a person they would otherwise never associate with. All because he and his team of white supremacist billionaires buddies convinced them it's what Jesus would have wanted. But if you're actually curious about what Jesus wanted, I would suggest you refer to the Beatitudes. The alleged true words of Christ. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers. And blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. In the future, many people are aiming to manipulate and cause harm, and they're going to do so in the name of God. They will wave a Bible while they scream in the face of the stranger. They'll tell you to spit on the poor and grovel at the rich. They will tell you that your neighbors are not worthy of your mercy or respect. These are not the faithful, nor are they truly followers of their own Christ. They're liars and thieves who will turn on you and turn against your greatest intentions. If someone is trying to use your religion to presuppose a seemingly edgy subject, it's probably because without it, the behavior would be unacceptable and for good reason. So do yourself a favor and always remember to stay informed, stay engaged, and stay decent, lest we suffer the meek to the tyrannical. Until next time, Internet fam, peace.